Welcome back to the American Superbike Show. I'm your host, Rich Turner, and the idea for this episode is something that I have blatantly stolen from somebody else. If you have any interest in racing of the four-wheel variety, I can't recommend enough the Marshall Pruitt podcast. It is literally one of the two shows that got me into podcasting in the first place. I started listening within the first few episodes coming out, and now he has a library that literally includes thousands of episodes. And I bring up Marshall's fantastic show because one of the things he does is share his love of motorsports, as he has produced dozens of episodes that could be anything from a microphone being mounted on board a race car, giving you the chance to listen in as a professional driver puts the car through its paces on a particular circuit. But he also puts out episodes where he would mount a microphone in an out-of-the-way location from the crowd just to pick up the ambient noises of the cars being out on a hot track. And so I use this as my inspiration. And this past Friday evening, during the fantastic Winter Throwdown that was put on by Corey Texter Promotions, I took Marshall's inspiration to heart. I took one of my portable wireless microphones and I attached it to the outside fence right at the exit of Turn 2. I chose that end of the track because earlier in the day the conditions were right, so that as the bikes were going through that end of the track, at least during the portions where the riders were off throttle, you could actually hear the tire working on the track surface as if it was asphalt. However, by the time I was actually ready to put this idea into practice and had everything in place, the conditions had changed a little bit, so you can't really quite pick that up anymore. But what you can hear is the riders come tearing across the start-finish line, followed by the silence as they get the bike to rotate through the apex before firing off back down the back straight, with their tailpipes pointed pretty much directly right at my microphone mounted on the fence. And then they just come back around and do it again. So the way the format worked for this session, I don't remember if it was termed opening warm-up or practice, but all the competitors that were going to out for the evening slate took part in this. And the evening lineup was labeled Group 2, but it included the headliners for the event. And so the way it worked is when practice opened, they sent the first group right out onto the track from a gate that was behind the start-finish line. And that group was allowed to go out and finish 5 flying laps. After taking the checkered flag, the class would circle around back down the back straight to an exit that was at the entrance of Turn 3. And then almost immediately, as soon as the last bike in a class would cross that line, leaving the track surface, the next group, the gate behind the start-finish line would open, and the next group would just be released right onto the track to start it all over again. And so the groups that were run in order, they were led off by the over 50 group, and then it was 250 amateur, followed by 450 am, over 40, premier expert, open amateur, over 30, hooligan, super hooligans, and the rest of the groups after that were the long list of competitors that were battling for the top open expert class. So just a couple quick notes before we start the beautiful two-wheeled music. One is that I believe it was during the over 30 class was on track. We did have one rider that had just a little minor low side, kind of close to my microphone at a low speed in turn 1-2 area. They did throw a red flag, but the bikes never really left the track, and they more just kind of stopped in place. And then once he was back up and on his bike, a green flag flew again, and everything continued on. On the recording, it's probably going to sound very similar to just one of these changes in classes, but it's still going to be the same group out there when they resume. And the other note I just wanted to include is that I did cut the recording a little bit short. I stopped after about 30 minutes. And at that point, it was just 450s from there on out on the track. And one of the things that I really wanted to accomplish with this recording was to try and get a little bit of the variety of the sounds that you could hear circling Callahan Speedway. Because there was the single-cylinder 4-stroke 250s and 450s, but there was also 2-strokes in the open classes and a couple of V-twins in the super hooligans. All in all, I can't recommend enough that you should try to come to this next year if you have the opportunity. And without further ado, let's listen in to the sounds of flat track racing.